So this is an off-the-cuff video, and if my hunch is correct, then this one is directed to my actual audience, which is another way of saying stay tuned. Those who are interested in game theory might be wondering at this point why some games just don't seem to work out. Or another way of putting it perhaps is, why do all games eventually fail? You could say that games are all goal-directed. And so built into that is the seed of their failure. It's kind of like those hedge fund guys who figured out how to play the market. Capital asset management? Is that what they were? Yeah, I looked it up. It's long-term capital management fund. Ha! It was called long-term capital management. How do you like that? In 1998, it was a $126 billion hedge fund. And the Fed had to intervene in order to avert a systemic crisis. It was a crisis still, but, you know, they kicked it down the road a bit longer. And here we are. They had an amazing strategy for gaming the system. That strategy changed the system. So inherent within every strategy, and you could say, you know, the entities and enterprises video that I made. In the entities and enterprises video, I describe kind of the basic pattern, the rise and fall of all endeavors, of all projects, species, individuals. So everything has its term, everything has its period. And that means that there are expiration dates to every strategy. So in a world which has increasingly become gamified, I mean, I guess you could make the case that it's always been a gamified world, at least in a material sense. Maybe this isn't really new information to anyone. Maybe it's just blatantly obvious. But it does strike me that there's a lot of negative byproducts, and that there might be a better way of thinking about this whole thing. Because ultimately, gamification is seeking to gain advantage. So the idea of playing a game is that you're going to win the chips. And so everyone is essentially competing in the marketplace of game strategies for however it is that they envision whatever the chips may be. And the tragedy of the whole thing, it's basically the multipolar trap. Because the competitive environment automatically creates the race to the bottom. Because whenever an individual actor is able to find a way of implementing a game that breaks the rules, then everyone is forced to break the rules. And that creates a race to the bottom. So the multipolar traps, if you're not familiar with that concept, look it up. It's really important. It's such an important idea. I don't remember who it is who talks about it the most. It's maybe when I edit this, I'll look that up. But yeah, it's a very basic fact of life. And I think that in essence, Nash equilibrium was an effort to address that, to bring everyone back into the fold and to have a game strategy that would create more winners. But it looks like the Nash equilibrium isn't really an equilibrium either. You know, in the same sense that long-term capital management wasn't long-term. You know, it's a temporary equilibrium. It was kind of a patch on what is essentially a system designed to fail. And so we would say that any system that's based upon the idea of gaining personal advantage is a system that's designed to fail. Because fundamentally, and this is where the video will switch to the prenatal, fundamentally, if we don't have the common good, if we don't have the greatest good at heart and as our goal, well, it's just never going to really work out that well, is it? It sets the conditions for its own demise, because the strategy is based upon past, an understanding of the past, an idea about what to do with it, and then the work to build it, right? So what does that tell us? It tells us that all game strategies are doomed to fail even if they succeed. Because in succeeding, they change the nature of the game. So what is a better strategy? Right? It couldn't be more obvious. And yet it's incredibly difficult to not want to not want. This is all about wanting. This one is not. Doesn't matter what you want. The question is, what's best? What's best according to what? Well, what's best according to the conditions that you're living in. What are the conditions you're living in? Well, it's the relationship between heaven and earth. We're here on earth. We're receptive to the conditions of earth, whatever it happens to be. Why is earth all yin? Because earth is ever changing. Why is earth ever changing? Because life has its goals. It has its desires. And it eats away at the fabric that it was built upon. So we might well ask ourselves, why would mountain be the limiting factor when it comes to game theory? And it is, you know, I'm just going to spell it out. It might be obvious based on what I already said, but like I said earlier, this whole thing might be obvious, or maybe I say it later. At any rate, it's about focus on memory, and it's the thing which begins the postnatal cycle, because it's right there before the dawn, you could say, in the east, in the northeast. And the memory of the strategy that we've been utilizing in order to bring about our victory is based upon prior conditions. But as we've pointed out, because of the multipolar trap, the conditions are changed by the activity. That's what's illustrated by long-term capital management. And so the entire strategy is one which, you know, this game theory strategy is something which inherently undermines itself. So you could say that we might have some strategy which is continually taking into account the ever-changing circumstance, but of course the complexity becomes outrageous then if we're thinking that we can manage on the basis of some understanding to continue to prevail. I mean, look at what's happened with humanity and its efforts to control nature. You know, the wheels are coming off that one, and we get better and better at it, and the consequences get worse and worse. And so now many people who study that particular issue believe that we are creating the conditions that will no longer allow for our species to survive. So that's the dilemma, the game theory dilemma. Here the question is simply, what's the best thing to do? For what? Well, I would say that the measure is to decrease misery. Never mind about increasing happiness, but to decrease suffering, to minimize the amount of suffering. This is simply because suffering is what causes violent change to occur. I suppose that's an arguable point. I could see that some people might say that that's simply not sufficient. But here's my argument. If it's true that this is a conscious universe, then in the same way that a body which is riddled with unhappy cells eventually becomes too miserable a place for the spirit to stay, then similarly a planet with nothing but miserable souls will become too miserable of a place to maintain by the Creator, or even by the inhabitants. And you could make the argument that the degree to which misery has overrun the place that we live in, that's the degree to which we no longer care to take care of it. So if your primary goal is not to decrease misery, then what is it? I would love to hear the argument against this. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for considering what has been said. I have more that I will release when I can. Adios.